Hello and welcome to the Allplane podcast. Like every week, we are going to explore an area of expertise within the aviation industry in the company of an expert professional. But before we get into this matter, the usual reminder that you can find these and other preceding episodes of the Allplane podcast, as well as many other interesting stories and content about airlines and commercial aviation on our website. That's Allplane.tv. I repeat it. This is Allplane.tv. So today we're traveling all the way to Johannesburg in South Africa, where our guest, Tendi Mutandagayi, will give us an overview of the state of the commercial aviation industry in the African continent. We're going to have a look beyond the current COVID-19 pandemic. We'll take a long-term view on the future of air travel in Africa. What are the latest news about the continent's main players, the growth of Ethiopian Airlines, the demise of South African Airways, the launch of new airlines all over the continent. We also outline some of the obstacles to the establishment of a proper Pan-African open airspace, and what are the trends currently shaping the airline sector in Africa. So get yourself comfortable and check today's episode out. So just paraphrasing a famous song, it's time for Africa. Hello, Tendi. How are you?
Hey, Miguel. Fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Experiencing the peak of the summer, which I think over there where you're located in Johannesburg, South Africa, is actually the opposite. You are seeing off the winter.
Yeah, we're looking forward to spring. It's close by now.
Okay. So basically, I was looking forward to have this conversation with you already for quite some time. First, let me introduce you. We've met working together on some business development consulting projects for an IFE company called EPI. And basically you have been working in African commercial aviation already for a number of years. So I thought it was a great opportunity to have you here on the podcast to talk about African aviation, because it's a continent, it's a huge continent that possibly doesn't get as much attention from the media. So I thought it was a great to have you one day here and we could review in depth all the different movements and activities that have been taking place in Africa recently, and also have a bit of an overview about, you know, what sort of the airline landscape looks like at the moment and what are the trends that can be expected to go on.
No, sure. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you taking the time and thinking of me and having a conversation. So, and yeah, Africa's an interesting place.
Indeed. First of all, would you mind introducing yourself just briefly to the audience? So you've got experience with Terrapin, you've worked for Sabre as well, and as I said, you now also collaborate with InFly on IFE projects.
Yeah, so basically that's a lot about my aviation experience. So I've been in the industry roughly about 9 years now. Started with Terrapin, which is a training and events company, and I was responsible for developing the Aviation Outlook, which became the Aviation Festival, and that sort of started my relationship with the industry. And I, after a few years, moved over to Sabre, where I was in the distribution team. So basically working with the travel agents and the airlines to come to agreements on the usage of the system. And that was like a good learning experience. And I've since gone out on my own as an independent consultant. As you mentioned, we've worked together on the in-flight entertainment wireless IFE projects around the world. And obviously one of the big ones that we have on the continent that I worked on is the Ethiopian Airlines project, which is ongoing and is live, but yeah. And also working on other projects with the Airline Association here and there. When someone needs some information or advice, I try and participate as much as I can. And that's me. And I'm passionate about the commercial side of the industry, especially distribution and how that works. And I'm trying to learn every day and contribute as much as I can. That's about me in a nutshell.
You're the ideal person to basically talk about all things aviation in Africa, because for a starter, not everyone in the audience is familiar about African aviation. To have a bit of an overview of the main players in the region, because it's a continent, it's a huge continent, as we said. You can divide it in different sub-regions. So correct me if I'm wrong. You have a main region, which is North Africa. So facing the Mediterranean, that's lots of connections with Europe. Then further down, you have the Sahara Desert, which is a very sparsely populated area. The other main economic area is actually on the other end of the continent, which is South Africa. And then you have South African Airways that is, well, it used to be the main player in African aviation, but now it stopped flying. So we will review this in more detail later, but at the moment it's very uncertain what's going to happen, right, with the South African market. Then you have other emerging airlines. I would highlight Ethiopian Airlines, which has emerged a bit as the strongest regional player at this point in time. Then you have a few other national airlines that traditionally have been relatively strong players regionally, like Kenya Airways, Air Mauritius, for example, both in financial trouble at the moment. You have other national airline projects being started in places like Senegal, Rwanda with Rwandair. I think Uganda wanted to start a new national airline as well. Then you have Then you have in Angola, you have also an airline that has some long-haul international connections. And then maybe I'm forgetting some other airline here, but then you've got lots of other local and regional airlines, which tend to be quite small normally, just a handful of aircraft operating in their area, right? So shall we maybe start by looking also at why there hasn't been really a very large, until now, a very large regional airline that has dominated African aviation. Maybe Ethiopian is the one that now it's trying to play this role, right? Like other airlines, it's developing a hub in Addis Abeba that's connecting Europe and Africa and Asia and America. Do you think that's really going to emerge as the top player in the continent?
I think Ethiopian Airlines is already the top player. They are, I stand to be corrected, a global player by some margin. I believe they're now the fourth largest airline by destinations around the world. So they have emerged to be the biggest player on the continent, and everybody obviously knows their story. But to answer your question on why until now, I guess, why there hasn't been so much furore about airlines on the continent. I think the first thing you'd want to understand about the African market is that even though we've got 1 billion plus people on the continent, the flying public or the people with the ability to fly is much smaller, and the size of our industry is much smaller than the world. So to give you context, Africa makes up about 2% or less of the cargo and passenger market, commercial passenger market. So there's not, in terms of scale and size, there's not a huge number or a huge size of an industry. But within that, there's room to grow. So, I mean, 16% of the world population is in Africa. You'd hope and assume that percentage by population would be reflected in the industry. So there's a gap for growth there. And the industry is developing fast, but obviously COVID has sort of slowed down that development. In general, it's a growing market. As you mentioned, the top players in your little intro there. Ethiopian is the largest one by obviously passenger numbers, and it's now obviously the gateway into the continent. It used to be through Dubai, but now it's through Addis Ababa, which we're proud to have as that. Another key player obviously would be the Egypt Airs, the Royal Emirates, the North African carriers, which have a huge number, especially for their point-to-point connectivity into Southern Europe. And Kenya Airways, South African Airways all do very well. And other players, like you mentioned, Air Mauritius, South African Airways, all still are forces to be reckoned with in the industry. And obviously, with the current challenges that they're going through, might come out the other side a bit smaller, but still robust enough to support an industry that's growing. So I think that's,
sorry. You mentioned 2% of the global aviation industry in terms of passengers.
I think even number of aircraft flying, we rank very low. But yeah, generally, in terms of the size of the industry, it's a small industry compared to the rest of the world.
And what about the low-cost industry? Because we have seen in other emerging economies in the world that they have been able to develop sizable low-cost industry, but it doesn't seem to be the case in Africa. I mean, you have in South Africa, you have a couple of low-cost airlines that I think they are doing okay.
Yeah.
But not the case in other large markets. I'm thinking, for example, there's another large country with a also very large population, like Nigeria, for example, that hasn't really produced a low-cost airline. And even, for example, Richard Branson, I think, launched a Virgin brand airline in Nigeria a few years ago, and it didn't really stick. So what happens that makes it difficult for even a low-cost airline to consolidate?
Well, I guess there's a few things I would hazard to would be the reason. The first thing is the size of the domestic market. As you mentioned, South Africa has some low-cost carriers which are able to support there's a domestic market that's able to support those airlines. And in the rest of the continent, not every market has the domestic market per se that can support that. And if we were to speak about Pan-African low-cost carriers, then you run into some difficulties. So one thing would be obviously, I'll start with price elasticity, right? That's the right word, yeah. Sorry, it was escaping me there. So it's been proven that intra-African travel is not as price sensitive as one would think. So that's been a bit of a difficult thing in the sense of the product that low-cost carriers offer, while popular and the price point might be slightly better. The passengers haven't seemed, because they're so accustomed to flying in a certain way, i.e. having a meal on board, being entitled to 2 pieces of luggage as the traditional carriers like the South African Airways and Ethiopian offer, the switch from an unbundled service has been difficult for low-cost carriers to implement. So there's a little bit of price insensitivity there. Low-cost carriers typically on the continent are probably encouraging first-time flyers to fly. The more sophisticated flyers are used to flying with their preferred carriers. And the cultural change of telling someone, instead of taking a bus, you can fly, has been difficult because obviously, like I mentioned, the luggage situation is hard to bargain with. When you tell someone, no, you have to pay for the luggage. On a bus, you can take almost as much luggage as you want, but on a plane, you can't. Also, on a full service carrier, you're entitled to free luggage, and now you can't. You have to pay for it. That's another thing. The other issues are around the cost of flying to certain airports. So there are no secondary airports in the market on the continent that are big enough to support a low-cost travel. So South Africa, there is one, there's Lanseria, which is a bit of a secondary airport in Johannesburg, which can support low-cost travel. But in the rest of the continent, you're flying into the main airports where the airport authorities have higher fees. Obviously, it's the taxes also in the whole continent affect low-cost pricing models. So all these factors are amongst the issues that the low-cost model faces in the market. And as always, navigation fees is different NSPs in the market. So that makes it a bit difficult for low-cost carriers to find the best deals because there's only usually one airport authority, one airport in the market that you can fly to. And the others, there's a lack of infrastructure in the secondary airports to support the type of aircrafts that would be used by a low-cost carrier, and passenger numbers as well to fill up a plane at a price point that low-cost carriers usually typically would want. And then start ancillaries is a bit of a difficult thing to do in the intra-Africa space at the moment. So those are some of the main points that would be affecting the model.
Because at the moment, there is no unified single skies in Africa, I guess.
So, yes, yeah, and that's something that the industry is working towards with something called SATAM, Single African Air Transport Market. That's what they're working towards, and that would hopefully enable the lower cost airlines to thrive. Mm-hmm. But there are pockets where it's working. In South Africa especially is a good example of that.
What sense?
A domestic market supports it. Secondary airports, we have a secondary airport, which is Lanseria, which can support that. The customer sophistication in terms of understanding unbundled fees and accepting them in the South African market enables airlines like Kulula and SAF and Mango to survive and fly.
There have been attempts to create sort of a Pan-African low-cost airline. I remember even one of them had the EasyJet founder involved in some capacity, but they didn't really work out. There was, I think it was called FastJet, right? And it ended up flying, but it was not nearly as large and international as it was expected. I think it ended up being a regional operation in Tanzania, I think, right? But there is another model which I find quite interesting because it's been literally unfolding the last few years, and that's actually driven by Ethiopian. Ethiopian has been buying equity stakes, investing in airlines all over Africa, in places like Chad. I think they helped set up the local airline in Malawi, I think in Zambia. In West Africa, they have invested also in some airlines. They also have cooperation agreements, I think, in Equatorial Guinea. I think I'm forgetting some others, but basically they have invested in about half a dozen airlines all over Africa. What's behind this strategy? They want to bypass this type of red tape and regulations by investing locally and then feed their hub. Is this purely financial investments, betting on the overall growth of Africa as an emerging economy? What do you think is the driver here?
Sure. Let me start with taking a step back to speak about FastJet. FastJet is still operational, and they're sort of based in South Africa and Zimbabwe at the moment. The reason, in my opinion, why sort of their situation was a bit difficult was the genesis of the airline started in the UK. As you mentioned, the EasyJet founder Stelios was part of the founding of the airline. And I think first and foremost, at first they started by managing the airline from the UK and managing an African operation a bit remotely, which was a bit difficult, I would imagine, which was the first thing. And then obviously as they got to learn the market, they moved the operation locally. And the issue they faced, there was two main issues from my point of view, was the states that they were in had national carriers or established national carriers, and they were sort of priced out of the market. I mean, I've heard rumors of some airlines flying wide-body aircraft on the domestic routes and pricing the FastJet out of the market. So it made it difficult for them to compete per se. And obviously, they do it at an economical cost. Even if it's a low cost, they can't obviously run at a loss. They want to be profitable. So that was like one of the issues they had there. And also, they obviously they used to fly, I think, A320s, and fitting a 180-seater on some of the routes where you're trying to stimulate the market was a bit challenging, and they ended up down gauging to Embraers, which I think was a fitting, which is the current model now, they fly Embraers, which is a fitting sort of aircraft 70-seater market while you're stimulating a market makes sense. And also distribution was a challenge in the sense that low-cost carriers are typically not found in the GDS as they were. So distributing online in a market that is traditionally travel agency driven was also a challenge that they faced. And the lack of infrastructure in the secondary airports and the like was also some stuff that came up as part of why they sort of had stunted growth. But if they can get out, I think in a few years, maybe now with all that's going on, there might be opportunities for them to grow again. And we'll have to see. And take it back to Ethiopian in terms of their strategy, which is slightly different, as you've already alluded to. I think a lot of what they're trying to do is to feed traffic into their long-haul intercontinental operations. I think that's the strategy, and they are buying into the airlines that they can or the regions that they can to, I think, contribute to the stimulation of growth on a continent and stimulating traffic, and also feeding the hub, which is Addis Ababa. And there's a lot of, I think, soft power, in my opinion, in terms of the political relationship that Ethiopia has with the rest of the continent. The African Union sits in Addis Ababa, so your EU equivalent, the headquarters are in Addis. There's a lot of political relationships between the countries. So having sort of air service between Addis and a lot of the cities, the main cities, is, I would argue, politically important. And Ethiopia has taken the mantle and decided they're going to open up those routes. And I think that's part of it. And also, SATAM hasn't, well, Yamoussoukro and the opening up of the African skies hasn't worked, essentially of ratification with local governments, right? And the African Union's headquarters is in Addis Ababa. So obviously, the links between all the countries that are members of the African Union to the city makes it easier for the airline to establish its roots and grow its footprint on the continent. I think it's a strategic move in Ethiopian sense, and they've taken up the role of obviously connecting Africa and investing in the continent. As you know, the gap between percentage of population and the market is an opportunity for any airline that can fulfill it. And they've decided they want to do that. And the state, the government, and the airport companies and everything around the ecosystem of Ethiopian supports their growth. Not that they fund them or they bail them out in the sense, but they are politically aligned or strategically aligned with the airline in terms of creating Addis as a hub, which they've managed to do, and as well as connecting and training all the people that all the resources that they need. So gathering all the resources that they need to grow. And one of them is obviously traffic into the hub. And they've managed to do that on the back of their African Union relationship. That's my take on Ethiopia.
Yeah, it's been quite an amazing growth that they've got. Actually, if a few years ago you had asked me, I would possibly have thought of Kenya Airways as the main airline in East Africa. But actually, Kenya Airways has been through some financial difficulties recently, I think, and it's being nationalized. Is that right?
To my knowledge, it's on the table, talks on the table, but nothing official that I've seen. But yeah, there's a lot of, I think, internal issues there, operational staff versus management. The competition is strong. Obviously, Ethiopian has been doing its business, and Kenya's struggled a little bit with their fleet and also market growth and ownership situation has made it a bit difficult for them to focus on growing.
What other interesting things are happening right now in African aviation? Because I have read about several national governments starting their own airlines with long haul projects. I think Senegal relaunched the airline. It used to have a national airline decades ago. Then I think it stopped flying, and then they relaunched it with flights to Europe and new aircraft. I think they operate the A330neo. Then we have Rwanda, which is a small country, but it's been growing quite a lot economically. The national airline has also launched some long-haul flights direct to Europe and to other continents. I think they have some flights to Asia as well. I think Uganda had also a project of starting a national airline. Why all this emergence of new carriers? Everyone has realized that aviation is such a strategic sector. I mean, what's the driver here?
I think it's a bit of both. Aviation obviously opens up the economy. There's obviously there's a lot of studies that show that where there's air service to a country, there's economic growth. There's a proportionate relationship there. And that's probably one of the reasons. And success stories, as you mentioned, Rwanda as a good case study. And I think also the realization that if we align government strategies to growth with the markets where the growth is, like you mentioned, Asia, China and Africa have a good relationship there. And providing air service to that would probably stimulate more growth for those economies. Speaking to why governments are starting to get into restarting some of those airlines that they had before or new airlines completely. I think it's the envy to an extent, or seeing those case studies of Rwanda and Ethiopia and thinking the economic benefits are worth it. That's probably the driver to me, in my opinion, the main ones. Yeah.
You mentioned a very interesting factor here in the equation, which is that in the last few years, the traditional investment and economic and even migration flows have been diversified a little bit, and you have a massive influx of Chinese investment in Africa. I'm thinking how this has been also a factor in the emergence of all these airlines like Ethiopian that have a very strong Asian-oriented operation, Traditionally, many African airlines, the ones that had a long haul operation, they normally tended to connect with European countries with which they had a historical relationship. Like you have the Angolan National Airline, for example, flying to Portugal. You had airlines from French-speaking parts of Africa to fly to France or to Belgium. And now you have airlines like Ethiopian, Air Mauritius, for example, or Kenya Airways as well, that are having more and more flights to Asia and to China. I guess that has been in part driven by these changes. And what about the foreign airlines? Because I don't know if any Chinese airline is currently flying into Africa. Definitely the Gulf airlines, Emirates and Etihad and Qatar Airways and Fly Dubai and some other, they have scaled up their operations in Africa considerably. So they have become a big part of the traffic is actually connecting these flows between Africa and Asia. What about Asian airlines flying into Africa? Are there many currently making all the way to Africa?
Not too many, to my knowledge, but you've got Cathay Pacific that has some routes, especially into Johannesburg, South Africa, and Air China. Stand to be corrected if it's Air China, Chinese Airlines, but one of the Chinese carriers that definitely flies into Johannesburg. And I think the African airlines have more traffic, more routes, or more aircraft flying that way versus the Asian airlines flying the other way. And that could possibly just be because of the demand from the local African traders and business people wanting to go there, and the Chinese airlines demand or flows being fulfilled and satisfied by those African airlines and the Gulf carriers, which you can connect from China through Dubai, through Europe, Amsterdam, and the like. So there's definitely traffic there. But the role of the foreign carriers on the continent is most of our traffic on the continent is international. So that's sort of the bread and butter of our continent in terms of traffic passenger numbers. And they come obviously traditionally through those colonial ties. But obviously, as the economics are changing a little bit with the Asians getting more into their dealings and business with Africa, there's some sort of change in flows. But still, the majority of the traffic on the continent is still facing Europe and the Middle East because of obviously the traditional Hajj and religious travel to the Middle East. But Paris is probably still the largest city pair between Africa and other city pairs on the continent. So Paris, let's say Cairo, Paris, Cote d'Ivoire. So it's still Europe dominates the connections, but the Asian side is growing, as well as Istanbul from Turkish point of view, which has a lot of them, which has, I believe, the most connections by an international carrier into the continent.
True. Yeah. I forgot to mention Turkish.
Yes.
Flies to
some most cities
no one else flies to.
Yeah. yeah.
And also looking west, we have seen also an increase in the connections to the Americas and even to the United States.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of routes that are among the longest in the world that connect South Africa to the east coast of the United States. There was also an interesting development. So it's basically the Icelandic group that controls Icelandair and some other aviation businesses. They invested in Cape Verde Airlines. Cape Verde is an archipelago which is off the coast of West Africa. And I don't know if they have done much yet with this investment, but there was some kind of talk that they might try to do also a sort of intercontinental hub, similar to what Iceland does in the North Atlantic, but in the South Atlantic. So basically, because it's not halfway, but it's located in a part of the African coast that it's closer to America, that you could then some connections there between Africa and America. That was I think the idea. Actually, there are already some flights going from Cape Verde to the east coast of the US, I think, but it's a small scale operation. That was quite interesting from not so much from a quantitative point of view, but from a qualitative point of view, I think. And so there's been all these flights to
interesting routes.
So you see this is a trend that it might continue, and you might see more activity on this side of things. So you have on one side, so traditionally it was more north-south to Europe. So you have the Air France's and Brussels Airlines and previously Savannah, and now you have all the airlines looking to Asia, but at the same time you also have an expansion also towards the Americas. So let's say the intra-African connections are not yet that established, but you have a growing connectivity with all the surrounding continents in all directions.
Yes. Yeah, indeed. And that's, I think, attributable to, for example, if you take the American carriers flying into Cape Town direct now, the local governments in those areas obviously did some research and kind of noticed that the economic flows between Cape Town and the US is sizable, and there's a market for tourists that are inbound throughout the year. It's sustainable, and they went out and did the traditional route development in partnership with all the key stakeholders in the South African tourism, the Cape Town government, some of the airlines and the governments involved in that. So there's been a realization that where there's economic activity, there can be air service. So if you use data and you look at the MIDTs and all of the other data out there, they've been using those kind of metrics to drive their route development. And I think it's an unrealized opportunity, like the Cape Town United from New York to Cape Town flight would be made sense, because I believe the market I think there was about 20% unrealized market in terms of the actual passengers from the US into South Africa that was untapped. And obviously providing direct links between places creates more and stimulates that route, and more people are interested in traveling in that. And regarding internally is Africa, obviously the main issues are around the visa situation between countries on the continent. As you mentioned earlier, most of the countries are aligned to the previous colonial history, and those borders were drawn across those lines, and the diplomatic relationships were previously along those lines. So, for example, as someone from Zimbabwe would need a visa to travel to Cote d'Ivoire, for example. And that makes it a bit of an issue for someone who wants to travel between those two countries. I'm not saying that's factual, but I mean, is an example of where issues come about, where you need to a visa to travel to that region. And also, there was never any air services during colonialism. And as Africa's become free and independent, there've been no establishment of air services between those continents, between those countries. Hence, you find people having to fly between, let's say, DR Congo, going to France to come back to a country that's 2,000 kilometers away. And those are sort of the issues that that have been impacting the growth of intra-Africa travel. But Afra and IATA are looking to sort of solve those problems with the single air transport market, which would allow airlines to open those routes that aren't open and add services to places where there previously wasn't service. And we've got the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is also in play, but obviously slow to adopt. But the countries are looking to do that, where you open up economic ties between countries without too many tariffs and too much red tape, which would make it possible for countries to interact with each other easier. And I trust that will help and open up that untapped opportunity of intra-Africa travel.
When it comes to distribution, I'm just thinking here, if there was a proper low-cost airline industry growing throughout the continent, in terms of distribution, it might benefit from the fact that I think in some parts of Africa, I read that, for example, mobile payments are very popular. For example, in Kenya, I think like a large percentage of the population uses mobile payments. There are some platforms that are working pretty well to do all sorts of things. So it could be an interesting test bank for all sorts of new ways to get people to use mobiles to book their flights and ancillary services, etc., etc. I don't know right now what's the distribution landscape like in Africa. I mean, is still the indirect channel, does it have a much weight at the moment? I remember, for example, in some markets, there were issues with, for example, the amount of credit cards that are in the market, made it necessary to develop other ways to get people to access services. So what's the situation like?
Well, the situation regarding distribution on the continent is still, I think it tracks most of the world in the sense that it's still driven by the indirect channel. In Africa, I think predominantly most airlines would probably say they distribute between 5 and 15% of their tickets directly, and the rest is through indirect channels, which is a typical travel agency.
Sorry,
that's still the case.
Tendi, can I stop you 1 second? You said 5 to 15%.
Yes, is direct. So on the website or the apps.
Okay, yeah, that's pretty low in terms of.
Yeah, it's very low, depending on the airline. And yeah, so I think it's not really a technology issue, as you mentioned, the mobile money payments. Most airlines have that capability to take payment that way. My guess would be the distribution situation in the market is driven by culture, in the sense that if people can transact and buy in the supermarkets using mobile money, why can't they just buy an air ticket? I think there's an element of, I want to be able to speak to someone while I'm buying it. I want some counsel, especially if I'm traveling internationally. I want the guarantee that I have some recourse. I know where to go if something goes wrong. I can call somebody. I know who I'm talking to. Has been a major factor around how distribution is working on the continent. And also, the airlines are trying hard to change that and encourage more direct distribution. That sounds like an oxymoron, but through like supermarkets and vendors that sell financial services and the like, to sort of distribute those tickets and take people off or change the culture of needing to speak to a travel agency. But regarding distribution, I think there's still driven by the travel agency, and also most of the travel currently is not leisure travel, and so there's a lot of corporate travel. There was a lot of corporate travel before COVID that drove the market, and corporates prefer to work with a travel agency that can help them with those things and the reporting and the recon required behind that. Technology to go direct exists in the market, like you mentioned, the mobile money. It's more, in my view, a cultural issue where people would want to interact and deal on such huge, big ticket items like flights with a person that they can come back to, get help and counsel. The culture around, I want to give my money to someone, and if something goes wrong, someone can help me, still exists in the market. The DIY culture around travel still not yet as mature as one would like. And also that the fact that the most markets on the continent are corporate driven. So business travel has been the key driver of air service on the continent. The mines around the continent, the tour, the conferences and the like are sort of the big ticket items for travel. As that changes, maybe direct distribution will become more viable, but currently it's not as viable because the corporates would prefer to work with a travel agency for reasons like, because a lot of business travelers need to be, duty of care becomes important when you have business travel. Sometimes it's security issues or fears when you travel to unstable regions. A travel agency group could provide sort of those kind of services with their partners, and that becomes more comfortable than allowing your employees to use direct methods of booking travel. And the leisure part is being stimulated. As I mentioned, there's an issue around visas for intra-Africa travel. So as visas fall away and as more tourism boards like the Cape Town government and South African tourism are good examples of encouraging tourism into countries, increase the activity to educate other Africans about the existence of the possibility of traveling to other places within the continent, the direct channel will grow. But for now, I think it's more culture and corporate focus.
What's the situation with the South African low-cost airlines? Do they have a significantly higher percentage of direct bookings, or it's still following the same patterns that you were mentioning?
I think South Africa is slightly a different market, and it's more advanced, comparable to a European market. We've got most of the low-cost carriers have the highest market share in the domestic market. So the point-to-point between Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban is very mature, and the passengers are very sophisticated and able to manage their travel. So the direct bookings are much higher. I've seen with other airlines, which I can't mention, obviously for confidential reasons, where they have 90% direct bookings versus indirect. But the attraction to indirect bookings is still there because a lot of the larger corporates would probably prefer their passengers via travel policy use indirect bookings with travel agencies, and also the loyalty programs, the benefits of that also keep indirect bookings alive. But generally, direct is very strong because of the low-cost carrier market and the sophistication in the infrastructure in South Africa, which is not the same for the rest of the continent.
So now that
aside from the North African markets. Yeah.
Now that we are in South Africa, where you are based, what's going to happen with South African Airways? What's the current situation, and do you think it's going to come back? And if it doesn't come back, what's going to happen to the South African market? Is there a gap that some other players will cover? I read recently that there was even a new low-cost airline project being launched in the short term.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit how you see things?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the gap in the market, as you mentioned. I think whether South African Airways survives or not, there's more than enough players in the market to meet the demand that is in the market. So we've got about 6 airlines right now in South Africa that operate. So you've got Kulula, you've got...
They are all low-cost airlines, the ones that are currently...
Mainly. So we've got low-cost carriers. We've got full-service airlines like the regional airline called SA Airlink. Also a small private airline called Same Air that can provide full-service services, as well as British Airways, a franchise managed by Comair, still in the market, which will still be in the market after post-COVID. So there's a mixture of a service for everybody, but obviously the low-cost industry or model is successful because of the sophistication of the market. But the gap will be, whether South African survives or not, will be filled. And what's happening with the airline is, your guess is as good as mine. We see the same things in the press, but obviously until something is official, we can't comment per se. But what I can say is that the airlines, in my opinion, it can be turned around, and if they can find a good model for it to exist, I think it would definitely be welcome, especially on the long haul routes. How I would see it, if I were a betting man or if I was advising South African Airways, would be to follow the Swiss Air model of returning to service, where it fell under the Lufthansa group after obviously the brand fell after the airline went bankrupt back then. So that model might be the best way to follow, in my opinion, where you keep the brand, but the ownership and the way it's operated would be under someone else. The only challenge with that is ownership rules in South Africa dictate that foreign ownership is only limited to 25%. So unless a legislative change would happen or private South African airlines or parties would come over and take over, that is the model I think would work. So that is what the government is talking about. And South African has the issue around financing and confidence around that. So lots of the financiers and lots of the money that has been used by South African is guaranteed by the government. But the South African government is also lost a little bit of capital in terms of trust. So the financiers are less enthusiastic about funding another or a new model for South African. And if they can get that right, then it can come back. But South Africans, we will survive without it, but we'd like to see it survive because there's a lot of employment attached to the airline.
Because the COVID-19 epidemic has been a bit like the last drop for South African Airways, but it had already issues before that. It had been on the brink already for quite some time, we must say that. What about the pandemic? I guess all airlines got grounded. Are they flying again?
The domestic airspace just got opened up for leisure travel yesterday, but business travel has been allowed for a while now. But obviously the passenger traffic numbers have been, compared to last year, the airlines that are flying have reported 4 aircraft. So in general, the borders are closed, but domestic within South Africa is resumed. And some airlines are announcing the reopening borders. I highlight Nigeria and Ghana, which have announced that they will be opening borders next month to international traffic. But the government's, speaking about the pandemic, what I've seen so far is the state-owned airlines are going to hopefully be bailed out by the government in a sense. And depending on, in terms of how much the governments can spare to aviation, which is sometimes viewed as a luxury, rather than a necessity, even though in my view it's necessary. So COVID situation, what I see evolving or happening would be some bankruptcies maybe, but some of the airlines will likely survive because of government support outside of South Africa, that is. The private airlines in South Africa had currently not been getting any state assistance, so we'll see how the long term pans out for them. They've been managing to get private investment, which has been helpful. But my prediction of post-COVID or what's happening with the COVID situation would be survival of the major brands will survive. The larger carriers will definitely survive, but they'll be leaner and more efficient. So they'll probably retrench a few people, get rid of a few inefficiencies in their operations. The investment in new aircraft will probably stop at all. There'll be second-hand aircraft used instead of buying new aircraft. Regional jet growth will continue. So that was a trend we were seeing in the market, but now it's definitely going to be forced to right-size your business in terms of the number of passengers your airline can realistically carry on the routes that you operate. So the network will dictate what happens to the market in terms of the size of the. So we've seen Embraer growing, and the Q400s also growing in the market in terms of popularity. So I think that's what we'll see, and hopefully this will speed up the single air transport market as the need for domestic growth. Like I mentioned earlier, the international traffic is what sort of drives the market in Africa. And if there's no international travel, maybe from a confidence situation or economic standpoint, the continent has to encourage and develop domestic and regional travels more than it has been. So that's what I see with the COVID situation is a shift to domestic and regional focus, regional jets in terms of growth, leaner airlines, and the major brands surviving. So I think Ethiopian, we know, will survive. Comair will survive in a certain format. Safair is doing very well. Kenya Airways will come back, but might be smaller. But the smaller ones with the less economically able governments might not survive. And that's sort of how I see it.
Okay, so I think that's a great roundup. We can leave it here today.
Cool.
But yeah.
Thanks. I hope it was useful, and I hope I made sense. You'll let me know.
Indeed. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time today.
Okay.
And hopefully speak with you soon. And
cool. And
continue.
Let me know when you're going to publish it.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
Very good.
Seriously.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Stay in touch.
I appreciate it.
Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.